The hospital called to confirm I'd been treating the patient I was accused of killing, but I'd never worked there. The woman on the phone introduced herself as Patricia Kemp, Patient Relations Coordinator at Riverside Memorial Hospital. She asked if I was Dr. Nathan Cross, which I confirmed. Then she said the medical examiner's office had requested verification that I'd been treating Eleanor Voss in the weeks leading up to her death on November 3rd. I stood in my kitchen holding a coffee mug, staring at the calendar on my wall, where November 3rd was circled in red, because that was the day I'd flown to Austin for a medical conference. I told Patricia I'd never heard of Eleanor Voss, and I'd never worked at Riverside Memorial. There was silence on the line. Then Patricia said my signature was on multiple treatment notes in Eleanor's file, my DEA number was on prescriptions written for her, and her family had specifically mentioned me by name when they filed their complaint with the state medical board alleging negligence that contributed to her death. My name is Nathan Cross. I'm 38 years old. I've been a hospitalist for 9 years, working exclusively at Mercy General in downtown Seattle. I treat patients admitted through the emergency department or transferred from other facilities, manage their care during their hospital stay, and coordinate with specialists. It's demanding work with long shifts and constant decision-making, but I'd built a solid reputation for thoroughness and patient advocacy. I'd never had a malpractice claim, never faced disciplinary action, never given anyone reason to question my competence or ethics. The idea that I was being accused of negligence in the death of a patient I'd never met at a hospital where I'd never worked was so absurd I initially thought Patricia had confused me with another doctor who shared my name. I asked Patricia to verify the information she had on file. She read me a medical license number that was mine, a DEA registration that was mine, and an address that was my home address in the Queen Anne neighborhood. Then she described the signature on Eleanor Voss's treatment notes. It was apparently neat and legible, matching the signature style I used on official documents. Patricia asked if I'd done any locum tenens work at Riverside Memorial, filling in for other doctors or covering shifts during staffing shortages. I told her I'd never worked outside Mercy General since completing my residency. She asked if I'd treated Eleanor Voss as an outpatient or in a consulting capacity. I repeated that I'd never heard the name before this phone call. Patricia's voice became more formal. She said she'd forward my response to the medical examiner's office and the state medical board, but I should expect follow-up contact since the documentation clearly showed my involvement in Eleanor's care. I hung up and immediately called the medical board. The receptionist transferred me to an investigator named Leonard Cho, who confirmed they'd received a complaint from Eleanor Voss's family regarding my treatment decisions during her final hospitalization. Leonard read me portions of the complaint. Eleanor had been an 81-year-old woman with congestive heart failure who'd been admitted to Riverside Memorial on October 15th with respiratory distress. According to the family's statement, I'd been her primary hospitalist, had ordered multiple medications that interacted dangerously with her existing prescriptions, had failed to properly monitor her declining kidney function, and had discharged her prematurely on October 28th, despite her fragile condition. She'd collapsed at home on November 2nd and died in the emergency department on November 3rd. The family believed my negligence had directly caused her death, and they'd requested a full investigation along with potential license suspension. I told Leonard what I'd told Patricia Kemp. I'd never worked at Riverside Memorial. I'd never treated Eleanor Voss. I'd been in Austin at a conference from November 1st through November 4th. Leonard asked if I could explain why Riverside Memorial had treatment notes signed with my name, prescriptions written under my DEA number, and billing records showing claims submitted for services I'd allegedly provided to Eleanor. I didn't have an explanation, but I knew I needed to see those records immediately. Leonard said he'd request copies of all documentation related to Eleanor's care and would schedule an interview with me once he'd reviewed the materials. He also informed me that pending the investigation's outcome, I should expect restrictions on my privileges at Mercy General and possible suspension of my medical license if evidence of negligence was substantiated. I called Mercy General's chief medical officer, Dr. Rebecca Lansing, and explained the situation. Rebecca had worked with me for 6 years and knew my practice patterns and professionalism. She was stunned when I described the allegations. She pulled up my schedule and confirmed I'd been working my regular rotation at Mercy General throughout October, with no gaps that would have allowed me to work simultaneously at Riverside Memorial. She checked our internal records and found no indication I'd requested permission to work elsewhere or filed the required conflict of interest disclosures that would be mandatory if I'd taken on patients outside our system. Rebecca promised to support me through the investigation, but she also said hospital administration would likely require me to take leave until the matter was resolved. Medical facilities couldn't afford the liability of employing a doctor under active investigation for patient death, regardless of the circumstances. I spent that evening researching Eleanor Voss in Riverside Memorial Hospital. Eleanor's obituary described her as a retired elementary school teacher who'd lived in Tacoma, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. The obituary mentioned her declining health in recent years, but framed her death as peaceful, surrounded by family. There was no mention of medical negligence or hospital care gone wrong. Riverside Memorial was a mid-sized facility in Tacoma, about 35 miles south of Seattle. It had a decent reputation, but wasn't affiliated with the university system or any of the major hospital networks. I'd never applied for privileges there, never attended any conferences or meetings at that facility, never had any professional connection that would explain why my name appeared in their records. The medical board sent me copies of Eleanor's treatment records 3 days later. I sat at my dining room table reviewing 200 pages of medical documentation that supposedly chronicled my care of a patient I'd never met. The handwriting on progress notes looked similar to mine, but with subtle differences in letter formation and pressure. The signature was close enough to pass casual inspection, but not identical to my authenticated signatures on other documents. The treatment decisions documented in the notes were concerning. Whoever had written these orders had prescribed medications without adequately considering drug interactions, had missed clear signs of declining renal function, and had discharged Eleanor despite abnormal vital signs that should have prompted continued observation. It was substandard care, the kind of practice that could legitimately result in disciplinary action and malpractice liability. But I hadn't provided that care. Someone else had, while using my identity and credentials. I contacted a healthcare attorney named Thomas Delaney, who specialized in medical malpractice defense and licensing issues. Thomas reviewed the documentation and my timeline proving I'd been working at Mercy General when Eleanor was supposedly under my care at Riverside Memorial. He focused immediately on the fraudulent aspect. Someone had impersonated you to gain access to practice at Riverside Memorial. Either they forged credentials to obtain temporary privileges, or they exploited some gap in the hospital's verification process. Either scenario suggests identity theft and fraud, not medical negligence on your part. We need to figure out who did this and why they chose to use your identity. Thomas filed an immediate response with the medical board, stating that I contested all allegations and that preliminary evidence suggested identity theft and credential fraud. He demanded that the board suspend any disciplinary proceedings against me pending a criminal investigation into whoever had impersonated me at Riverside Memorial. He also contacted Riverside Memorial's administration and requested all documentation related to how I'd been credentialed to work at their facility, what verification procedures had been followed, and whether anyone on their staff had noticed anything unusual about the doctor claiming to be Nathan Cross. Riverside Memorial's response came from their legal department. They provided copies of a credentialing application supposedly submitted by me 6 months earlier, complete with my medical license number, board certification details, and DEA registration. The application included professional references from doctors I actually knew, though when Thomas contacted those references, they all said they'd never been contacted by anyone from Riverside Memorial requesting verification. The application also included a copy of my driver's license, my medical school diploma, and other identity documents that appeared legitimate. Riverside Memorial's credentialing committee had approved the application, and I'd been granted temporary privileges as a hospitalist to cover staffing shortages. According to their records, I'd worked sporadic shifts throughout September and October before treating Eleanor Voss during her October hospitalization. The driver's license copy was particularly disturbing. It showed my face, my actual face from my current Washington State driver's license, but I'd never submitted that document to Riverside Memorial. Whoever had orchestrated this fraud had obtained a copy of my license and incorporated it into their fake credentialing application. Thomas filed a police report with the Tacoma Police Department alleging identity theft, fraud, and potentially criminally negligent homicide committed by someone impersonating a physician. The detective assigned to the case, Robert Haynes, had worked on white-collar crime and fraud cases for 15 years. He understood immediately that this wasn't a typical identity theft scenario where someone opened credit cards or filed fake tax returns. This was targeted professional impersonation with potentially fatal consequences. Detective Haynes interviewed staff at Riverside Memorial who'd worked with the doctor, claiming to be Nathan Cross. The nurses and residents described someone who fit my general physical description, about 6 feet tall, athletic build, mid-30s, but several mentioned he'd been unusually quiet and had avoided social interaction with staff. One nurse said he'd always worn a surgical mask during rounds even outside patient rooms, claiming he had a cold and didn't want to risk infecting vulnerable patients. Another nurse mentioned he'd declined to attend a departmental meeting, saying he had family obligations. The physician's assistant, who'd worked most closely with him during Eleanor Voss's hospitalization, said he'd seemed competent, but somewhat rusty on current protocols, occasionally asking basic questions about the hospital's electronic medical record system that an experienced hospitalist shouldn't need to ask. When Detective Haynes showed hospital staff my photograph, their reactions were mixed. Some said the doctor they'd worked with looked like me, but might have been slightly different around the eyes or jawline. Others said they couldn't be certain because they'd mainly seen him masked or at a distance. The most useful identification came from the emergency department physician who'd been working when Eleanor Voss died. Dr. Monica Sterling said she'd called the hospitalist who discharged Eleanor to inform him of her death and deterioration, and she remembered being struck by how defensive and dismissive he'd been. When shown my photo, Dr. Sterling said the person she'd worked with resembled me, but had darker hair and might have been a few years older. She said if she'd been asked to pick me out of a lineup, she wouldn't be confident identifying the man she'd known as Dr. Nathan Cross. The break in the case came from the hospital's security footage. Detective Haynes obtained video from multiple cameras covering the main entrance, parking areas, and internal corridors during the dates when the imposter had worked at Riverside Memorial. The footage showed a man in a white coat and hospital badge moving through the facility, but the quality wasn't sharp enough for facial recognition software to provide a definitive match or exclusion compared to my known photographs. What the footage did show was the imposter's vehicle. He'd parked in the same section of the hospital garage multiple times, and the security cameras had captured his license plate. Detective Haynes ran the plate and found it registered to a man named Julian Thorne, age 41, living in Olympia. Julian Thorne had attended medical school 15 years ago, but had never completed a residency program. According to records from the Federation of State Medical Boards, Julian had been dismissed from his residency in internal medicine during his second year for multiple incidents of unprofessional behavior and clinical errors. He'd never been licensed to practice medicine independently. After his dismissal, Julian had worked in various healthcare-adjacent positions, medical equipment sales, pharmaceutical consulting, patient advocacy services, but had apparently never stopped wanting to practice as a physician. Detective Haynes obtained a warrant to search Julian's residence in Olympia. What they found was a comprehensive identity theft operation. Julian's home office contained files on 6 different physicians, including me, with detailed dossiers of our credentials, practice patterns, and personal information. He'd collected copies of our licenses, DEA registrations, board certifications, even sample signatures that he'd apparently practiced replicating. His computer contained forged credentialing applications for multiple hospitals throughout Washington and Oregon, suggesting he'd been impersonating physicians at various facilities for at least 2 years. The documents showed systematic fraud. Julian would identify hospitalists who worked regular schedules at specific facilities, which made their movements predictable and their absences from other locations unsuspicious. He'd submit credentialing applications to smaller, understaffed hospitals that might be desperate enough for coverage to expedite their verification processes. He'd work sporadic shifts, enough to earn income, but not so many that patterns would emerge or staff would get too familiar with him. Among Julian's files was specific information about me, my work schedule at Mercy General, my home address, my vehicle registration, even photos apparently taken outside my apartment building. He'd been surveilling me, learning my routines, preparing to assume my identity if needed. The question was why he'd chosen me, and why he'd allowed Eleanor Voss to deteriorate under substandard care that would inevitably draw attention to his fraud. Thomas Delaney believed Julian had simply made clinical mistakes that exposed his lack of proper training. A real hospitalist would have recognized Eleanor's declining kidney function and adjusted medications appropriately. Julian, despite his medical school education and partial residency, didn't have the clinical experience to manage complex patients safely. His fraud had cost Eleanor Voss her life. Julian Thorne was arrested at his home on November 18th. He was charged with multiple felonies including identity theft, fraud, practicing medicine without a license, and criminally negligent homicide in Eleanor Voss's death. During questioning, Julian initially denied everything, but confronted with the evidence from his home office and the security footage, he eventually requested an attorney. His defense lawyer tried to argue that Julian had completed most of his medical education and his clinical decisions during Eleanor's hospitalization had been reasonable given the information available at the time. The prosecution countered that Julian had deliberately deceived Riverside Memorial about his credentials, had stolen my identity to gain privileges he wasn't qualified to hold, and his substandard care had directly caused Eleanor's death through medication errors and premature discharge. The medical board suspended their investigation of me and issued a statement clearing me of all allegations related to Eleanor Voss's death. They acknowledged that I'd been the victim of identity theft and that no evidence suggested I'd provided care to Eleanor or had any connection to Riverside Memorial. The statement was supposed to restore my reputation, but the damage was difficult to quantify. News outlets had reported on the initial allegations, describing a Seattle hospitalist under investigation for patient death. Some outlets published my name alongside photos pulled from Mercy General's website. Even after the medical board's exoneration and Julian's arrest, online searches for my name returned articles about the investigation before articles about my vindication. Patients Googling their doctor before appointments would find concerning headlines before they'd find exonerations. Eleanor Voss's family was devastated by the revelation that their mother had been treated by an imposter rather than a licensed physician. Her daughters, Christine Voss and Amanda Warren, released a statement through their attorney expressing anger at Riverside Memorial for failing to properly verify credentials and grief over their mother's preventable death. They filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Riverside Memorial, alleging negligent credentialing and failure to maintain adequate oversight of physician staff. They also filed suit against Julian Thorne personally, though their attorney acknowledged that collecting damages from an unemployed fraud artist would be challenging. Thomas Delaney advised me that the Voss family might also name me in their lawsuit, not because they believed I'd harmed their mother, but because my identity had been used in the commission of the negligence. Being named as a defendant, even if ultimately dismissed from the case, would still require my involvement in depositions and legal proceedings. I returned to work at Mercy General in early December, 2 months after Patricia Kemp's phone call had upended my life. My colleagues were supportive, but I noticed subtle changes in how some people interacted with me. There was an extra beat of hesitation before consultants accepted my treatment recommendations. Nurses double-checked orders more carefully. Administrators asked more questions about my clinical decisions. I understood why. Even though I'd been exonerated, even though everyone knew I'd been the victim of fraud, there was still an association between my name and a patient's death. People wondered subconsciously if maybe I'd been involved somehow, if maybe the story was more complicated than it appeared. That's what false allegations do even after vindication. They leave residue. The criminal case against Julian Thorne moved through the system over the following year. His attorney attempted multiple defenses. First, they argued Julian had completed sufficient medical training to qualify as a physician and that his residency dismissal had been unjust. Expert witnesses from his former program testified about his clinical errors and unprofessional conduct, undermining that defense. Then they argued that Eleanor Voss's death had resulted from her underlying heart failure rather than Julian's treatment decisions. The prosecution brought in medical experts who testified that Eleanor's kidney failure had been iatrogenic, caused by medications Julian prescribed without proper monitoring. and that her premature discharge had eliminated the opportunity for early intervention when she began deteriorating at home. Finally, they argued that Riverside Memorial's negligent credentialing process, not Julian's actions, was the proximate cause of Eleanor's death. The judge rejected that argument, ruling that while Riverside Memorial bore civil liability, Julian's deliberate fraud and unlicensed practice were direct causes of harm. The trial included testimony from multiple physicians Julian had impersonated over the previous 2 years. I wasn't the only victim of his scheme. He'd used at least 5 other doctors' identities to obtain temporary privileges at small hospitals throughout the Pacific Northwest. Most of those cases hadn't resulted in patient harm, but there were other instances of substandard care, missed diagnoses, and medication errors. The pattern suggested Julian had been gradually improving his clinical skills through illicit practice, treating patients as learning opportunities without proper supervision or accountability. Some of his victims testified about the professional damage they'd suffered, investigations they'd endured, and reputational harm that lingered even after exoneration. One physician described losing his position at a small rural hospital after administrators decided his association with Julian's fraud created too much liability, even though he'd been completely innocent. Julian was convicted on all major charges. The sentencing hearing was emotionally charged. Eleanor Voss's daughters testified about their mother's final days, describing how they'd trusted the doctor who'd said she was well enough to go home, how they'd believed his reassurances that her medications were appropriate, how they'd blamed themselves for not questioning his decisions more aggressively. Christine Voss said she'd spent months wondering what they could have done differently, what signs they'd missed, before learning their mother's doctor hadn't been a real doctor at all. Amanda Warren said the betrayal was worse than the loss, that their mother had trusted the medical system, and that system had allowed an imposter to play with her life. The judge's expression during sentencing was severe. Julian Thorne's actions represented a fundamental violation of the trust society places in medical professionals. He'd stolen identities, deceived institutions, and practiced medicine without qualification or oversight, ultimately causing the death of an elderly woman whose care he'd bungled through a combination of incompetence and fraud. The judge sentenced Julian to 15 years in prison for identity theft, fraud, practicing medicine without a license, and criminally negligent homicide, with provisions that he'd be permanently barred from working in any healthcare capacity upon release. I attended the sentencing hearing. I wanted to see Julian Thorne face consequences for stealing my identity and damaging my career. I wanted to understand who he was and why he'd chosen this particular path of fraud. During the proceedings, I studied him carefully. He was unremarkable looking, medium height and build, generic features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. He wore glasses and a conservative suit, presenting himself as respectable and remorseful. But his statement to the court revealed something darker. Julian said he'd never meant to harm anyone, that he'd only wanted to practice the medicine he'd trained for, that his residency dismissal had been unjust, and had stolen his dream of becoming a doctor. He framed himself as the victim of an unfair system that had refused to give him a second chance. He didn't apologize to Eleanor Voss's family. He didn't acknowledge that his lack of proper training and clinical oversight had killed their mother. He remained convinced that he'd been qualified to practice, that his mistakes had been no worse than those made by properly licensed physicians, and that his only real crime had been working outside the approved credentialing system. The civil lawsuit against Riverside Memorial was settled out of court. The Voss family received a substantial financial settlement, and Riverside Memorial agreed to implement comprehensive reforms to their credentialing process, including mandatory verification of all references, direct contact with state medical boards, and enhanced background checks that would include searching for any disciplinary actions or criminal history. The hospital's medical director resigned, as did the administrator who'd overseen the credentialing committee. The facility's malpractice insurance premiums increased dramatically, and their reputation in the Tacoma medical community was damaged for years. Several physicians resigned and sought positions elsewhere, not wanting to be associated with an institution that had allowed an imposter to practice for months without detection. I was never formally named as a defendant in the Voss family's lawsuit, but I did provide deposition testimony, describing how Julian had stolen my identity, and used my credentials. Meeting Eleanor's daughters was difficult. They knew intellectually that I hadn't harmed their mother, but seeing my face, the face they'd seen in Julian's fraudulent documentation, clearly triggered painful associations. Christine asked me during a break in the deposition if I'd ever figured out how Julian had obtained my personal information. I told her he'd surveilled me, photographed me outside my home, collected my documents through various means, including likely theft from my mailbox or hacking my personal accounts. She asked if I'd taken steps to prevent future identity theft. I described the credit freezes, monitoring services, enhanced security measures, and constant vigilance that had become part of my daily life. She nodded and said, "At least I was alive to take those steps." Her mother wasn't. The professional consequences of Julian's fraud extended beyond the immediate investigation and trial. Medical malpractice insurance carriers flagged my profile because my name and credentials had been associated with a patient death, even though I'd been exonerated. Some insurance companies required additional premiums or declined coverage entirely until sufficient time had passed to demonstrate the incident hadn't created ongoing liability risk. Hospital credentialing committees at other facilities where I applied for privileges asked detailed questions about the Eleanor Voss case, requiring extensive documentation proving I hadn't been involved. Each job application, each insurance renewal, each professional reference check became an opportunity to relive the fraud and explain circumstances that shouldn't have required explanation. I joined a support group for victims of professional identity theft, which I hadn't known existed until Thomas Delaney mentioned it. The group met monthly and included professionals from various fields whose identities had been stolen for fraudulent purposes. There was a lawyer whose name had been used by someone filing frivolous lawsuits, an accountant whose credentials had been used to perpetrate tax fraud, and a teacher whose identity had been used by someone seeking employment at a school where they had no intention of actually teaching. We shared strategies for protecting ourselves, discussed the psychological impact of having our professional reputations violated, and supported each other through the slow process of rebuilding trust in systems that had failed to protect us. I testified before a state legislative committee examining credential verification requirements for healthcare facilities. I described how Julian had exploited gaps in Riverside Memorial's process, how small hospitals facing staffing shortages sometimes expedited credentialing to fill urgent needs, and how the current system relied too heavily on documents that could be forged rather than direct verification with primary sources. The committee ultimately passed legislation requiring hospitals to conduct video interviews with at least 2 professional references as part of the credentialing process, to verify licenses directly with state medical boards rather than relying on submitted documents, and to implement biometric verification for physicians accessing electronic medical records to prevent impersonation after credentials were approved. 3 years after Patricia Kemp's phone call, I received a message through Mercy General's patient portal. It was from Amanda Warren, Eleanor Voss's younger daughter. She said she'd been working with a therapist to process her mother's death and the betrayal by Riverside Memorial. Part of her healing involved acknowledging that I'd also been a victim of Julian's fraud, that my name and reputation had been stolen just as her mother's trust had been violated. She said she was sorry for any residual anger or blame she'd directed toward me during the legal proceedings. She understood I'd done nothing wrong and that Julian alone bore responsibility for what had happened. She hoped I'd been able to rebuild my career and that I didn't carry guilt for circumstances beyond my control. I wrote back thanking her for reaching out and acknowledging how difficult it must have been. I told her I thought about her mother often, about the life Julian had stolen through his fraud and incompetence. I said I hoped she'd found some peace, knowing that Julian had been held accountable and that Riverside Memorial had implemented changes that might prevent similar tragedies. I said I still carried the weight of having my identity used in a crime that cost someone their life, even though I knew rationally I hadn't been responsible. I told her that healing from violation took time and that we were both doing the hard work of processing trauma that shouldn't have happened. I'm still working as a hospitalist at Mercy General. I treat patients with complex medical needs, coordinate care between specialists, and make dozens of critical decisions every day. But I'm more paranoid now. I check my credit reports monthly. I have alerts on all my professional accounts. I monitor medical board databases to ensure no one is using my credentials. I keep detailed documentation of my whereabouts and work schedules in case I ever need to prove again that I wasn't somewhere I'm accused of being. The fraud changed how I interact with the world, added layers of suspicion and verification to activities that should be straightforward. When I meet new patients and they Google my name before appointments, I wonder what they find. Do they see articles about my exoneration or articles about the initial investigation? Do they read carefully enough to understand I was the victim? Or do they skim headlines and conclude I was involved in a patient's death? I've considered changing my name legally, starting fresh with a clean identity that isn't associated with Julian Thorne or Eleanor Voss. But that feels like letting the fraud win, like allowing Julian to steal not just my credentials, but my entire professional identity. Nathan Cross is my name. I earned my medical degree. I built my career. I won't let someone else's crimes erase that. Julian Thorne is serving his sentence at a state corrections facility. I don't follow his case closely. I don't need updates on his appeals or his adjustment to prison life. He took months of my life and years of my peace of mind, but I refuse to let him occupy more mental space than necessary. The justice system worked slowly and imperfectly, but it ultimately held him accountable for his fraud and for Eleanor's death. That has to be enough. 5 years after the hospital called to confirm I'd been treating Eleanor Voss, I spoke at a national conference for healthcare administrators about credential verification and identity theft prevention. I told my story to a room full of professionals responsible for hospital security and physician oversight. I watched their expressions shift from curiosity to concern as they recognized vulnerabilities in their own systems. When I finished, multiple administrators approached me asking for specific recommendations on strengthening their processes. I gave them contact information for forensic verification services, described the legislative changes Washington had implemented, and emphasized the importance of treating credential verification as an ongoing process rather than a one-time checkbox. One administrator asked if I'd ever forgiven Riverside Memorial for their failures in credentialing Julian. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness isn't really the framework I use. They made catastrophic mistakes that allowed an imposter to practice medicine under my name. Those mistakes cost Eleanor Voss her life and damaged multiple careers. But I also understand that fraud artists specifically target systems designed to facilitate legitimate healthcare. Julian exploited good faith assumptions that physicians would be honest about their credentials. Riverside Memorial learned from their failures and implemented reforms. That's the most anyone can do after tragedy reveals systemic weaknesses. I don't carry anger toward the institution anymore. I save my anger for Julian, who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.